Hi everyone, thank you for being here. For those of you who don't know who I am, my name is George Palau, and I am Cornell's Federalist Society president. This is our very first speaker event, so we're all very excited. I'm appreciative that you're all here today. I just want to briefly say that I was looking at the RSVP list. And I noticed that there are a lot of LLM students, and I was really happy to see that because oftentimes you don't get too many LLM students coming to JD events, and I just want to make it clear that you guys are always welcome to all of our FedSoc events, and we hope that for the short time you are here that you keep coming to all the events that interest you, and just be aware that you're always welcome. The last thing I'll do before I introduce the host for today is, this event, while we will be discussing about the future of the United States and the relationship of the country with China, we also have to keep in mind about what today is, and today is September 11th, and just over 20 years ago, it was perhaps the darkest and most tragic day in our history. So I'd just like to take this opportunity to show remembrance for that time and to honor these people with just a brief moment of silence if possible. All right, thank you very much, everyone. And now I'll introduce Jesse Gervasio. Thank you.
Hey guys, how's it going? My name is Jesse Gervasio. I'm one of our vice president speakers here at the Federalist Society, and very happy to see how many of you guys turned out today. The way that this will work is our speaker is going to speak for around 40 to 45 minutes, and then you guys, if you have questions afterwards, I'll be happy to pick you guys out one by one and you can ask your questions. So without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and jump into this and introduce our guest speaker. Doug Bandow is Senior Fellow at the Cato Institute, specializing in foreign policy and civil liberties. He worked as Special Assistant to President Ronald Reagan and editor of the political magazine Inquiry. He writes regularly for leading publications such as Fortune magazine, National Interest, the Wall Street Journal, and the Washington Times. He speaks frequently at academic conferences, on college campuses, and to business groups. He has been a regular commentator on ABC, CBS, NBC, CNN, Fox News, and MSNBC, and holds a JD from Stanford University. Without further ado, let's give a warm welcome to Doug Bandow.
Well, thanks, I appreciate it. It's great pleasure to be back at Cornell. It's always fun for me to get outside of Washington, D.C., which is a rather incestuous place these days. George is right. For those of us who lived through 9/11, it was an extraordinary event. It was transformational in terms of U.S. policy. And it helps explain the last 20 years. If one wants to know where endless wars came from, whether you like that term or not, that's kind of in the lexicon. You wonder, why Iraq showed up in Afghanistan. I mean, all the things that kind of came out of that American involvement in Yemen and a host of other countries. You really go back to 9/11. So, I mean, it has this extraordinary human impact in terms of those who lost their lives, family members, lost their friends and others. But it also had a transformational impact on U.S. foreign policy. And one of the ironies may be that it in certain ways may have helped avert a potential contentious relationship between the U.S. and China at that time. In April of 2001, there was a famous EP-3 spy plane incident. The U.S. had a plane flying in international waters, but off the coast of Hainan Island, which has major military bases of the People's Republic of China. And while it was legal to fly that way, the U.S., of course, would not have been very happy to have had Chinese spy planes flying along its coast. And we saw the reaction about the balloon incident. And one of the Chinese pilots was rather aggressive, hit the EP-3. He died. His plane went down. EP-3 had to make an emergency landing on the island. And it took a week or two of negotiations and kind of back and forth before China sent the personnel plus the disassembled airplane back to the United States. And of course, it's a spy plane. They were quite interested in terms of the technology on it. But so there was a certain contentiousness there, and then 9/11 happened. And that really could have pulled all of the oxygen out of Washington. It was very hard to do much of anything else, at least until 3 or 4 years after the Iraq invasion, which was in 2003. So in an odd way, 9/11 did have an impact on US-China relations. When you're thinking about China, there's what's probably a fake curse, but you'll hear people say the famous Chinese curse, may you live in interesting times. From what I've read, it's probably a fake. Nevertheless, it really is a wonderful, kind of saying, because we certainly are living in interesting times. That if you look at the world today, of course, we're quite busy. That you can imagine if you were president, you're worried about Russia and Ukraine, you're worried about NATO, you're worried about everything in the Middle East, Africa, India, etc. And then you've got Asia. Of course, Asia has increasing importance for the United States compared to Europe in terms of population, economic growth, and security. And foremost in Asia, of course, is China. And it's not quite fair to say that Asia is kind of China and the others. China plays a predominant role. China has a huge influence on Asia. That's inevitable. An American should have no illusions about that. That whatever your objective is as an American policymaker is not going to be to kind of turn China back where it was, I don't know, 1976 or something. The reality is China is a hugely important country, economically, politically, militarily, civilizationally, culturally, all of these things. And that influence is very, very important in Asia. And I just came back from Malaysia. I was in Malaysia last week for a conference. And very few Asians want to have a conflict with China. And very few Asians are interested in being pushed to choose between the US and China. So what the US faces in kind of looking at China is this is a huge issue, a very complicated issue, and a very difficult one. And the first step I want to kind of throw on, trying to explain and talk about China in 30 minutes or 40 minutes is obviously not a very easy thing. There's a tendency, of course, if you get involved in foreign policies, you get yourself a trip, you show up in the capital of another country for a few days and you decide you understand that country and announce you're an expert. And China is the last place where you should try that. This is a country with a heritage that goes back thousands of years. There's a massive Chinese diaspora. The history of China is extraordinarily complicated with different dynasties. And you look at the I've always thought if you meet somebody, I've visited China more than 20 times, and you see somebody who looks 80 or 90 years old, it always struck me, what did they live through? They may have started out when it was an empire, and then there's a republic that overthrows the empire, and then there are the warlords, and then of course the Japanese invade, and then there's a civil war between the nationalists and the communists. And then you have lunatic rule by Mao Zedong. And then there's an opening to the United States. And then Deng Xiaoping liberalizes, and China joins the international economic community. And here we are today. And imagine living through all that. And that is what that country has gone through. So you start thinking about what the US is dealing with. It's dealing with a very complex kind of, it says almost an organism in terms of what China is. And what kind of has gone into China and made China, today. And I do think the first point is that we want to, in many ways, rescue US-China policy from politics. Today, China has become one of the hottest issues on Capitol Hill. And it's very ugly. And issues need to be debated, but if your foreign policy becomes determined by how much can you prove you hate another country, your policy towards that country is probably not going to work out very well. We kind of saw that start out with Donald Trump, where right after, I think it was March after he was inaugurated, he brought Xi Jinping over, heading down to Mar-a-Lago, had this really wonderful visit. It seemed like they're all going to be really buddies. And then lo and behold, COVID happens, and suddenly China becomes the great enemy. And by 2020, the Republican senatorial committee was telling senatorial candidates their best way to get reelected was to attack China. And Democrats, of course, were happy to respond. Nobody on Capitol Hill lets the other side grab an issue and take it. And we see that today, where ironically, the Biden administration in many ways has been tougher than Trump administration on China. And now we have a Republican-dominated committee in the House that's investigating. A man, a smart man, Representative Gallagher. Nevertheless, somebody who, it's fair to say, doesn't like China very much. So there's now kind of an investigative committee, and both sides go after each other for being soft on China. And we see all of these issues, security, economics, culture, and other sorts of things being dragged in. And if you look next year, it's almost certain that it's going to get worse, because I think I'm not going to get partisan here. All I can say is that the thought of an election between the last two guys and doing it again, one can imagine where that race is going to go, and it's not towards the highlands. Okay, and one can imagine as they go after each other with hammer and tongs, trying to kill each other politically, they're going to use anything they can, and China's going to be part of that process. And while one should go after China if one thinks one should, one wants to be, do it only where it's necessary, as opposed to suddenly turn into kind of demonizing another country for the sake of political gain. And the problem with China is that it's very complicated issues, and actually it requires sophistication, it requires nuance, it requires a fair amount of humility, and a certain amount of caution in trying to think through issues and what to deal with, how to deal with them, what the challenges are. We've got to understand the issues, have to treat them differently, because some are far more important than others, and have to distinguish what's the difference between, say, competition and a threat. At what point does one become another? And that is not always easy. And I think the first point is that China is a unique challenge for the United States, and I do think it is a challenge for us. That because what China brings together is something that no other challenger does. I mean, people talk about a new Cold War kind of indicating the Soviet Union. China is not the Soviet Union. I mean, most of you, I don't think, lived through the Cold War. I did. But China is just nothing like it. The Soviet Union was an economic basket. The primary challenge was military. It did not have high tech. That's one of the things that destroyed it. It was unable to compete in those areas. It had very little cultural appeal to other peoples. It didn't have much soft power. You didn't go to Joseph Stalin because he was warm and cuddly. The Soviet challenge was an evil one, but it was very different. Again, in many ways, overtly evil. And it had those wonderful demonic figures that you could point to in terms of, look what happened during, the Great Purge, and the Gulag, et cetera, et cetera. So that's not China. China is radically different. China is an ancient civilization. It's these days an economic behemoth. It's huge. By purchasing power parity, the economy of China may very well be larger than the United States. Purchasing power parity tries to measure not exchange rates, it tries to measure kind of the goods and services combined. It's a complicated thing. It trails in terms of exchange rates, and its growth is slowing. So we may find that China does not overtake the United States in the way that people at one point had suggested. Nevertheless, China is an enormously sophisticated country. And one can see that. On my first trip there was in the early 1990s, in Shanghai, which is one of the economic powerhouses, the area of Pudong, which is across the river, across from what they call the Bund, was basically empty. I mean, they had 2 or 3 buildings they built up. They took us on a tour in a little bus. It was like sagebrush blowing in the streets. Nobody was there. I mean, you're just trundling down these empty. Today, you go there, it is built like Manhattan. It's just extraordinary. So you see this transformation, radical transformation. It has extraordinary impact internationally. It has reach, not only in East Asia but elsewhere. I mean, we see Chinese investors, we see Chinese trade, we see Chinese involvement in Latin America, we see it in Africa, we see it. It's a controversial issue even in Europe. So this is something again one did not see with the Soviet Union. And I think in many ways the greatest challenge, I suppose, for the U.S. is that in a sense you have what is a Leninist state, or at least a Leninist party. I think that's where Xi Jinping is. I'm not so convinced that Xi Jinping is a Marxist, but I think he's a Leninist. That is able to use the resources generated by a very productive economy. And that gives the Chinese state heft and ability that the Soviet Union never had. I mean, I joked when I first went to the Soviet Union that they were recycling their tanks into toilet paper. This was a place that could not even make toilet paper. In my first trip there, we talked to journalists. They didn't have pens. I mean, when we left, we kind of gave them everything that we had. We had a conference over there. People in Malta. So you're just kind of giving. How do you get aspirin? I mean, who knows, right? How do you get pens when you're a journalist? That is not China. I mean, China is so radically different. I mean, in many ways, that's the biggest challenge. That if you have a political competitor that has that economic power and cultural reach, that makes China something very, very different. Now, it's often been said these days that engagement failed. And I think that's a real mistake. Clearly it was oversold, the idea that, well, if you have, China economically engaged, they'll become democratic. Because I'm not an economic determinist. One shouldn't assume that economics determines everything else. Nevertheless, it's very important to think about time. In 1972 was the opening of China, where Richard Nixon, went over to China, President Nixon, and he did that primarily as geopolitics. He wanted to pull, China away more or less as an ally against the Soviet Union. It was a brilliant geopolitical vision. In 1976, Mao Zedong dies. And if you want to read about Mao Zedong, read about the Cultural Revolution, read about the Great Leap Forward. You read about what rule was like, what life was like. You can find some very good books out there. He dies. Deng Xiaoping turns out to becomes the paramount leader. It took a couple of years, political struggle. This stuff is messy. And then he pushes economic reform. Dramatically changed China. In 1989 was Tiananmen Square. And it really was the clash of potential liberals with, the old line like Deng Xiaoping. And there were a lot of liberals. Deng Xiaoping had to fire 2 successive CCP general secretaries. And at the end of Tiananmen Square, millions of Chinese members of the Communist Party were purged because they had the wrong tendencies. They had not supported the government. They supported protests. Protests were not just in Beijing, protests were around the country. That the opening to the West after Mao's death really did create ferment and debate on politics. Where liberalism lost in that struggle in Tiananmen, nevertheless, I told people that up into the kind of mid-2010s, that it was kind of a soft authoritarianism. Cato worked with NGOs. Now they're very careful. You didn't criticize the government, but we could hold conferences freely and openly. I have a group of us, a bunch of us libertarians, who taught free markets at the School of Marxism at Northeastern University in Shenyang. I've done that 10 times. I've done 7 of those. Our last trip was 2019. COVID has shut all of that down. But we could talk about anything we wanted. Now, we were careful. We did not attack the Chinese government. But there was that opportunity to have a debate. Students, we could engage. All of that is now being wiped away. And Xi Jinping has brought in, and that's why I would call him a Leninist, very much this is someone who has decided the centrality of the party and his own power. But the problem there is, for him, is that he's on the summit, but he's also on the precipice. Because if things go wrong, there's nobody else to blame. I mean, at this stage, all the people at the top are his. There's been this interesting issue with the foreign minister, who matters a lot in international relations, just disappeared. Oh. And everything he said was wiped from the website. And imagine if tomorrow Antony Blinken kind of disappeared from Washington. They go to the website, you scrub everything, every photo, every statement. It's gone. Antony who? No, I don't know who you're talking about. I don't see it. Who is that? That was the case of the foreign minister, who was in fact Xi Jinping's guy. And we still don't know what happened. They eventually said, oh, he had to retire because of health. They believed it. That was gone. So, and there's a lot of embarrassment there because he was Xi Jinping's guy. I mean, the last party Congress is when last fall he was appointed. So they had to go back to his predecessor and drag him back into the job. So I think it's important to realize that engagement should be part of any strategy. That there is no one strategy the US should use in terms of dealing with China. Nevertheless, to my mind, one of the most important parts of the future is engaging the people of China. That this is not just government to government, this should be much broader. And economic engagement, personal, cultural, tourism, all of that stuff I think plays a role. None of it guarantees anything. But I tell people, do you really want a really, really, really big North Korea? If you think isolation works, and I've been to North Korea twice, I mean, you really don't want to turn China into North Korea. You really don't want that. You want to have a China that's engaged in the world and has something at stake in the world, as opposed to be thinking in terms of we can just kind of hide them off somewhere. They'll go away. That won't happen. So the second thing is, I think it's important not to be kind of panicked. I mean, there's a certain panic in some folks you talk to who just think like China's won, China's going to win. You see some of these, the books that are out there. China faces extraordinary challenges. If you read about today, slow growth, Slow growth has political problems because growth has been one of the chief selling points of the Chinese Communist Party. You don't have elections, why should you be in power? Well, if you're delivering growth, you're giving people something they want. If you're not giving them growth, suddenly, well, why should you be there? There's a lot of things that go with it. I mean, again, a lot of complexity. I mean, it's real estate markets, they're overbuilt. You can go to some Chinese cities, they're ghost towns. They built, I mean, you'll find, you go on YouTube, you can see some of the, they're blowing up these apartment buildings. The developers went bankrupt. So they're kind of half built, sitting there for years. It's bringing it down. And the Chinese have typically used kind of apartments and real estate as essentially a savings mechanism. And there are a number of people there who you pay your mortgage as they're supposedly building your home or your apartment. But, well, you know, they get the money and they spend it, and they don't seem to have built the apartments. But guess what? You've already given them all your money. This is a bit of a problem. And it's a political problem. People have been protesting, etc. I mean, there's a lot there. I mean, in terms of debt, state enterprises aren't very efficient, have big debts, state-owned banks have been pushed to give a lot of loans to these enterprises. There's a lot of increase in terms of kind of regulatory stuff. Basically, all companies have to have party cells, and there's a lot of stuff going on that, in terms of authoritarianism and decentralization, that are not likely to help Chinese decision making. You know, and everybody wonders who tells the big guy, Xi Jinping, that he's wrong. Who walks into his office and say, Jinping, dude, that was a really stupid decision. Probably not the best way to get yourself promoted. I mean, if you read stories about White House, I worked in the White House for a short period of time, a long time ago. And you get stories of people who want to bring in outsiders to tell the president what they're afraid to tell the president. But often even the outsiders show up, and you get into the Oval Office, and you think of all the history there, and the president sits you down, and you have this nice chat, and you just get weak-willed, and you kind of wilt, and you don't tell him anything. Because you're facing the great man, and oh my goodness, who wants to be the one to kind of spoil the occasion? You're getting your picture taken. I have one of those, whatever. Well, it's even worse where you're dealing with, like, send you to prisons. I mean, there's this big debate, I don't know if you saw that, what happened to Hu Jintao, the previous president. Not at all clear. I mean, some of the China specialists don't believe it was political. They think he had health issues. Nevertheless, it was quite dramatic. I mean, the guy's previous president, they kind of drag him off the roster. Goes, and you kind of imagine that in terms of if it's politically direct, it could be a rather unfortunate thing. So we should don't assume that China is the winner and has won the world. It strikes me that the future is open. And to me, that is extraordinarily important. Is that we, and most importantly the Chinese. I mean, China's future is China's future. China's future will be determined by the Chinese people. The people in Washington like to believe they rule the world. That what they do in Washington is the most important stuff that goes on in the world. Everybody gets up in the morning, how do we change the world? And I'm writing an article, I do a column, and Jake Sullivan, and National Security Advisor, made this statement: how dare North Korea sell weapons to Russia? They're going to regret it. We're going to do what we can to punish them. Well, for 30 years, American presidents have said North Korea cannot have nuclear weapons. They do. What they're doing now is working on ICBMs, multiple independently MIRVs, the re-entry vehicles, and multiple, we have multiple warheads. They're working on submarine launched missiles, cruise missiles, and tactical nuclear weapons. So now the North Koreans are supposed to be afraid of Jake Sullivan because he's going to do what? If they sell artillery shells to them. I mean, it's just, we kind of tell everybody what to do. Well, telling the Chinese what to do is not going to work. Right? Xi Jinping and company are not particularly interested in what American policymakers want. But the good news is the future is not set. Now I go back to, if you lived in China in 1976, 20 years later, you lived in a radically different country. One of my early trips there was a travel writing trip, a tourist kind of trip. And the guides were talking about how they could get married now and didn't have to get government approval. They could choose their own jobs. They could move. That what you saw was a radical transformation within just a few years. So one should not assume that where China is today is where it will always be. We don't know what the future is. So the idea then would be to play the long game, is to think about how you engage. Where do you try to respond tough? Where do you try to engage, work together? Where do you, I mean, again, choosing what's the competition, what's the threat, what are the issues? And this is not a blanket, China is evil. China is very complex. Make decisions within your dealing, with the issues, play the long game. Now, there's a lot of issues out there. I just want to run through fairly quickly, then we can open it up. One is kind of an ideological challenge. I do not think that we're dealing with, like the Soviet Union, a Marxist-Leninist state that wants to make the world Marxist-Leninist. I think we have a Leninist state that is nationalist. It wants China to have a major role in international affairs. I don't think it matters to China very much the kind of government that, well, I don't know, Ghana has, or Serbia has, or Brazil has. So China wants influence, but it's a very different thing from subversion and kind of what the Soviet Union was up to. Now, the US might still be concerned about that, but it's a different kind of concern. We need to, so we start talking about Cold Wars and stuff. I was like, well, this is really different stuff. That I think they want global domination. I don't think it's global domination. They want, in a sense, they want China to have a role commensurate with their influence and power. And from an American standpoint, that's scary because that's always been our role. I mean, I joke that, the Monroe Doctrine, which formally says we don't want the Europeans playing around in Latin America, that our Monroe Doctrine is that we get to dominate the globe up to everybody else's border. So you don't dare tell us what to do in Cuba, but we can tell you what to do with Taiwan. They're equally close. Well, why? Well, you can do that if you have raw power. But when the raw power changes, suddenly it gets much more complicated. So one is, what is the nature of the challenge? And that's when we have to try to work on. People disagree on this issue. I mean, serious sinologists come up on different sides. Another is human rights. Human rights in China are awful, and they've gotten a lot worse under Xi Jinping. When I went there mid-2010s, I sat in my car and I looked over and I saw on the bumper of another car, Chinese license plates, the famous Christian fish. So if any of you are familiar with this, basically it's the Greek letters and French Christ. Now, and this is Beijing. I took a picture of it and wrote an article about status of religious liberty in China. And at that point, it was kind of provincial. For the most part, if you were careful, you didn't play politics, you probably wouldn't be bothered. The estimates were there were probably more Christians than members of the Communist Party. Today, it's much, I mean, you have pictures of Xi Jinping up, you have Communist Party propaganda up, churches are closed, kids can't go to church, there's a whole bunch of stuff. Freedom of speech, independent journalists, human rights lawyers, students, I mean, in terms of what happens if you try to transgress online, all this stuff has gotten tougher. Groups get closed. Cato dealt with a group called the Unirule Institute. I went to their last headquarters back in 2019 when I was there. And about a month or two later, they were closed down. And they never attacked the government. They were they promoted free markets, but they were very academic. They write these tomes that even I get bored reading. And they couldn't publish, the executive director couldn't travel, they found it got closed down, the government shut it down. And so we've seen a lot of stuff happen. And you throw into that Xinjiang, throw that Hong Kong, all of these things are rather complex. And there's a historical background to all this stuff. Hong Kong is part of China. It's got a unique role, but again, trying to understand this stuff, there's always history of stuff going on in terms of why it happens. And we need to realize how little our influence counts when it comes to something like human rights. No government allows another government to determine its politics. So the question is, how do you try to promote better human rights? What's the mechanism? What are your objectives? How do you fit that in with everything else? Again, not an easy answer. It's very hard to just go after one issue. We want to maximize human rights. Okay, that's great. But then what about all these other issues? And how does that fit in? There are a lot of issues of kind of sovereignty and economic kind of independence for the United States. You get into questions of Chinese influence operations. There's been a real question of Confucius institutes, a lot of which work with universities. There are issues of technology transfer, the question of attempting to seize the commanding heights of industry. That's what we see with the big argument over semiconductor chips. We see the Belt and Road Initiative. It bothers a certain number of Westerners, I think actually rather silly. The Belt and Road Initiative, which is a lending program to third world countries, not worked out very well for the Chinese. Just as if one looks back over the, first say from 1945 to, I don't know, about 1995, the World Bank, IMF, regional development banks are almost all disasters. Massive amounts of lending, most of it wasted, massive debts, constant restructuring of debts, utter disasters. So for the West to kind of lecture China about, oh, this is dangerous, you're going to hook these countries on debt. I'm thinking, yeah, the West has a good experience in that. They spent 50 years throwing all this money away, which we used by dictators that built airports in their kind of home cities. Everything falls apart, and then of course they're expected to pay it back and all this stuff. Nevertheless, there's a whole bunch of that stuff. Again, this is, how do you deal with all those things? The things that I think the West has to be concerned about, the actually use, going after, say, families of Uyghurs, people who've escaped Xinjiang get pressured by the Chinese government, and they use families in Xinjiang as hostages and other stuff. There's a lot of stuff that goes on that I think the US and others need to be concerned about. But again, there's a mix here. What do you do on semiconductor chips? Well, actually, the industrial policy that China has used has not worked very well. They spent tens of billions of dollars trying to grow the semiconductor industry, and it hasn't done that much. So the question is, will the US spending money actually help the industry, or is it going to just piss money away in a way that a lot of the industrial programs have done so? Then there are kind of threats to kind of broadly speaking, just economic engagement and trade. This is where you get decoupling. The question is in supply chains, you want to kind of move supply chains. And then there's been a lot of concern about, well, decoupling might be a little too much, trying to pull everything apart. And then they talk about de-risking. The administration talks about a small garden with high walls. And that makes a certain amount of sense, but what goes in the garden? Okay, semiconductor chips, how about AI? How about what goes in, what goes out? And if you make some bad decisions, you're going to hurt the US economy. American semiconductor manufacturers have made a lot of money selling to China and elsewhere, money that they use to invest in new products. So if you cut them out of that market, suddenly they can lose hundreds of billions of dollars of sales while you're giving them out of tens of billions. So this stuff, again, is very, very messy. And in Capitol Hill, it's all very simple. We have this act, and everybody feels good, and we have a signing ceremony, and off we go. But in the end, what's going to come out of it? Then national security threats. And I think what's critical here is Americans, policymakers, talk as if a threat to an ally in Asia is the same as a threat to America. And let me just say, China does not plan on attacking America. Okay? I mean, there's actually this wonderful podcast where a guy, it's literal. He says the Chinese are going to be filling merchantmen with tanks and sending them to the West Coast to invade California. And you're kind of sitting there thinking about, really? Really? And this guy goes on, and the podcast host thought this was all very terrible. But thankfully, virtually nobody in Washington actually thinks that. But it kind of shows a certain nuttiness that the moment you start demonizing another country and imagining how awful they are, you can come up with a lot of crazy stuff. China is not going to try to seize Hawaii or Pearl Harbor. It's not going to try to invade the United States. That is not the security issue. The security issue is whether the United States is able to maintain its domination of Asia off the Chinese coast. Now, that might be good for Washington policymakers, so I don't dispute that. We have to realize what we're talking about. The US would never accept what we expect the Chinese to accept. I mean, imagine if the Chinese Navy went up and down the East Coast and in the Caribbean. Imagine if the Chinese were lecturing the US on policy towards Cuba and said they're going to defend Cuba. And if you had Beijing was filled with people talking about the potential of having to go to war with the United States, what would Americans do? You think they'd say, oh, well, that's okay, right? We don't mind. No, they would say, F you. They would say, build ships, build nukes. That's what the Chinese are doing. They're going to expand their nuclear force. They have 300 or 400 nukes now, but they're talking about going up to at least 1,500. They want to be comparable. They want to make sure they're not subject to nuclear coercion. And that's what the issue of Taiwan. Now, Taiwan's a wonderful place. In my view, the Taiwanese are entitled to set their own political destiny. This is a historical one. It gets into nationalism. It gets into history. Japan took it in 1895. There's a lot of reasons why China views this importantly as part of China. But the question the US has to decide at some point is at what cost and risk is the US prepared to go to war with China over an issue that China views as existential, but which might be hard to explain to the American people. the war games that they run in Washington, for the most part, most of them show the US losing. The ones that even show the US winning in the sense that China does not successfully take Taiwan have the US incurring huge losses. CSIS recently did a war game. The best case was losing a couple of carriers, around 5,000 sailors on each, and 200 to 300 aircraft. The worst case took the loss of aircraft up into the hundreds. So, I mean, so there's always the issue of nuclear escalation. I think the critical point here then is to understand that relative intensity of interest matters. And the question, and I look at Japan, well, what do I care about Japan? Do I care about Senkaku Islands, or do I care about the integrity of Japan? Well, I care about the integrity of Japan. I actually don't think China has any interest in trying to invade Japan. I think it would go very badly if China tried. You know, so then the question is, well, it's one thing for the US to have a security guarantee to the integrity of Japan, but do we want to go to war over the Senkaku or the Diaoyu Islands, the Chinese call them? You know, the Philippines, which, you know, I mean, their flagship at one point was a discarded US Coast Guard cutter. You know, they want to go toe to toe with the Chinese Navy, essentially without a navy. You know, do we want to go to war with China over places called like Mischief Reef? It's great, the perfect name for it. You know, these are places that the Chinese claim and the Philippines has no ability to hold. You know, so the security issues require the US to have a serious discussion about how vital are these and what is America willing to risk and lose, and then to have a conversation with the American people. You don't go to war over this stuff by promising everybody that it'll be fine, the Chinese will go away if we just are talking. And that's what you hear in Washington, you just have to be talking. Deterrence, reestablish, you know, no, this is a huge issue for China. And we have to understand how important. So I think just thinking about security issues, the main military issues is not defense of the US directly. It's indirect, and you've got to decide how important you think those interests are and what you're willing to spend and risk to do this. Very important. So in the end, I think American policymakers need to not panic. The worst thing to do is to try to come up with policy in the heat of an election campaign or just trying to outdo the other party. We need to play the long game, and Americans should be confident. You know, the US has come through a lot. I think China faces extraordinary challenges. And ultimately, we have to recognize China's future is China's. So the question is, how can the US engage China and work with China to encourage what we think might be better policies in the future, recognizing that America's influence is always going to be limited. The US cannot reach into China and fix China. Well, so we have to recognize our limitations and try to come up with a policy. But my hope is at the end of the 21st century, we see two great countries cooperating and not having fought one or two wars. Because if there's one war, I don't think it's only one war. I think it's probably 2 or 3 wars. And I think of Germany. In the late 1800s, the United Kingdom faced 2 rising powers. And until then, the United Kingdom wanted the biggest navy on earth. And they counted as the 2-nation standard. They wanted their navy to be bigger than the next 2. Well, when the US comes along, they finally decided we just can't match the US, so they gave that up. But Germany, they still treated as an adversary. And it took 2 world wars to figure out where Germany fit. You know, and after the First World War, yeah, the Germans lost, but they didn't stay lost. They decided we're going to try this again. So to imagine that if there's a war between the US and China, and if America wins, however you define that, that China will then say, oh, that's okay, fine, you win, we give up. Very unlikely. You're talking about more decades of conflict, more conflict, not less. Again, one has to count the cost and think very seriously about the future. I'll stop there and I'm happy to take any questions.
All right, we'll take you guys' questions now. So if you have a question, just raise your hand. We'll try and get to as many of you as possible. In the back.
Sure, thank you so much. So I have a question. I have 2 questions about Taiwan. First is, do you think the US will support Taiwan militarily if there's a conflict across the strait? So by taking into military, I'm not saying providing loans or like weapons to the army over there, but to actually send the troops to join the actual conflict. And the second question is, how much influence do you think the US government has over the upcoming election in Taiwan? Thank you.
Well, America's influence matters in Taiwan because Taiwan wants US support and they recognize the US could pull that. Chen Shui-bian, going back to the first DPP president, actually, was believed the US was stuck defending Taiwan and actually wanted to do an independence referendum. And the US put every pressure it could on him and said, don't you dare. So there certainly is an understanding there. At some point, I think the majority of Taiwanese, I think, recognize the status quo is better than trying for anything radical. I mean, you'll light the fuse. Well, the president has on 5 occasions said the US would defend Taiwan, at which point his aides have rushed out and said, oh, he doesn't mean any of that. Well, my view is if the president 5 times says he would do something, he probably would. I mean, the question is, when reality hits, what would happen? There'd be enormous pressure to do so in the sense of commitment, the sense of credibility. But I also think there'd probably be a very serious discussion in any administration, in the Pentagon, the White House, of, oh my God, what are we getting ourselves into? Unless America's allies support it, the US is going to lose. That is, how do you project power 6,000 to 7,000 miles? You need bases, at least in South Korea and Japan. I don't believe South Korea would go in. I think the president of South Korea would run screaming from the room at the phone. Because it would mean Chinese missiles descending upon every military base in the Korean Peninsula. It also might be a phone call from Xi Jinping to Kim Jong-un saying, hey, dude, this might be a good chance to kind of go across the border. But Americans are going to be busy elsewhere, so let's go for it. So, and I think even the Japanese, they talk tough now, but they've made very clear they've made no commitment. They've said they will defend themselves. They've said no commitment to defend Taiwan. So there'd be a lot of pressure on the US to go on, but I think there'd be a very serious debate then. I want that debate now. I don't want it to occur in a crisis.
Yeah, thank you for your time. I appreciate it a lot. In terms of like ways, like you said, we're not trying to make policy right now just because we're trying to decide like a presidential election, but in terms of ways to exercise soft power, do you like right now what Biden's doing with Vietnam and establishing relations there, as well as like, you know, at least the Fed talking about the CBDCs and all that? Do you like, you know, that working with Johnson's?
If you want to deal with China, you need to deal with it with friends. I mean, you don't want to deal, and that requires that you be softer. That is, for example, you're trying to deal with the European, I mean, in terms of semiconductor chips, for example, we want Japan to go along with us. We want Netherlands to go along with us because they're major producers, especially in terms of machine tools and other sorts of stuff. You know, so yes, I think that, now, again, recognize the limits. Let's have no illusions here. That, you know, Vietnam is a very complex case. They fought a war in '78. The Chinese invaded, didn't do very well. I mean, Vietnam had a battle-tested military. The Chinese military not fought for a long time. But you have the parties have a fairly close relationship, but the Vietnamese state, especially over naval issues, so they're happy to have America around. You find that in, say, the ASEAN countries, Southeast Asia. They want America around. They like the idea of us being involved, but again, they don't want to have a war with China. So but I think we should be there. You want to talk to them. You want to work with allies. You figure out how far you can go. The more if you want to deal with trade issues, you know, Donald Trump started the trade war with everyone. Well, he should have worked with the Europeans to go to China. If the US and Europeans go to China together, they're much more likely to get a good deal without a trade war than, you know, you're going to just start the trade war. So yes, I think working that is a very important part.
Okay, thank you.
Go ahead.
China, as far as I know, has been rapidly expanding its navy, building a lot of ships and other very valuable assets. Do you think this rate of production in the Navy and also in the Air Force could keep going, or is it going to level off at a certain point?
Well, China now has more ships than the US, though the US has more tonnage. American ships overall would probably be more powerful, but the Chinese Navy is very professional and very serious. I mean, the one thing that they lack, and I think the war in Ukraine might have given some caution, which is the US, unfortunately, has fought a lot of wars, which means Americans service members actually have experience in some of those situations in a way that Chinese do not. That does matter. China has a lot more shipbuilding production capability than the US. I think they're going to continue. I mean, at some point, they're going to decide they have enough. And the potential limitation these days might be economic. I mean, the economic downturn is pretty serious. I mean, I've got an invitation to go to China next month, and I'm trying to fund my trip. And my Chinese friends who've had organizations that have invited me in the past are saying, you know, basically we don't have any money. You know, things are kind of tight here at home. So that at some point is going to impinge on the military. Nevertheless, I think it's a high priority for Xi Jinping. So I would assume, well, they're going to continue. I mean, it may be a measured pace, but they're not going to stop.
Go ahead.
Okay, so first off, thank you for your time, and I just wanted to ask. So many experts predict that there's going to be negative consequences to China's demographic issue that are going to be felt within the next few decades. I just wanted to ask whether or not you believe that it's going to have a significant impact on China's economic and otherwise their capabilities on the global scale.
Demography is one of their big challenges. I mean, they had one-child policy, and at some point along the way, a decade or so ago, they decided that was a bad policy. So then they said everybody could have 2 kids, and now they're trying to encourage members of the party to have 3 kids, not working. Fertility rates are basically not moving. Part of it is culture, part of it is expense, part of it's a tough working environment. There's a whole bunch of stuff that goes into it. No, it's hugely important. I mean, this is a rapidly aging society. The number of workers is falling. The thing that brought enormous wealth to China over the last 30 years is bringing surplus workers from the countryside into industry. There's no more of them. They actually are having fewer, the number of workers is falling. If you look into demography. And this is an age-oriented society where you take care of your elders. Well, there's one of you, 2 parents, 4 grandparents. And they're not a rich country. I mean, Japan went through a certain amount of this, but Japan was rich as its demography started to collapse. China is not rich. China, you figure they have, even if their economy is as large as America's, they have 4 times as many people. So you cut the pie into 4 pieces. It's hard to know. I mean, if you look at the ultimate projections, by the end of the century, they get like 400 million people, and the numbers are extraordinary. I mean, they can change. These things are subject to a lot of variables. It will certainly, I think, put some limits in terms of their economic growth, and may very well put limits in terms of, there's another thing about manpower for the military versus industry. A lot of that stuff, I think, it could impinge. I think one wants to be careful to say they will collapse. Gordon Chang, who I know quite well, has spent 20 years saying they're going to collapse. Well, maybe China eventually will, but if you've been saying it 20 or 30 years, you don't get much credit if it eventually happens. But I do think they could face some serious difficulties against that.
Go ahead.
Hi, thank you for the talk. One of the things you talked about was engaging the Chinese populace, and you also mentioned later decoupling. I just wanted to know what your thoughts were on the effectiveness of that, because there was a very similar situation with Germany attempting to economically couple with Russia to prevent later Russian actions, which didn't work when Russia felt they had an existential threat, like China feels they do with Taiwan. So, to what extent do you think economic integration with China can be effective on affecting their foreign policy, and to what extent do you think the United States should go to continue the decoupling or de-risking? Like, what do you think is the ideal scenario?
Well, it's hard to know an ideal scenario. I mean, look, I have to realize that engagement in all of its forms is but one policy. If you're Germany and you have economic engagement, you expand NATO to the doorstep and you want to bring in countries that, I mean, Putin and other Russians warned multiple times. Go back to 2007, read his speech at the Munich Security Conference, warned multiple times. Fiona Hill, who was in the NSC during Trump, wrote to her superiors at the State Department back in 2007 that if you bring Ukraine into NATO, you risk a war with Russia. It's not as if this stuff wasn't known. So the point is, if you have contradictory policies, don't assume which one's going to be more important. What I'd say is that do not assume engagement with Chinese stops the government from doing bad things. But part of it is who's going to be the leader of China in 20 years, 40 years, 60 years. A number of the people around Gorbachev had been part of American programs that helped fund Soviet students outside of the Soviet Union. I mean, Gorbachev had to be somebody who kept a lot of stuff secret. I mean, he would never have been chosen to be general secretary if they knew what kind of human he had humanity. They didn't want to kill people. They kept the army in the barracks. So what I'd say is that we play the long game. That broadly speaking, engagement is useful as a tool. Don't overplay it. And I think that clearly there are areas of security of a supply chain that you want to. It's not so much that you can't have any in China, but you probably want to spread it around. You don't want all your eggs in one basket. I mean, it's a danger even in the US. When they had freezes in Texas, American semiconductor chip production was hurt very badly because the areas where Texas had all this stuff going on tend to have a high concentration of semiconductor producers. So that's where I would say de-risking is a better term than decoupling. One should not go in with the idea that we're going to pull everything apart just to pull everything apart. It's take a look at what the industries are. And China's doing this. Xi Jinping is very concerned about the US targeting Chinese producers and whatnot and hurting them. So you're seeing on both sides this is happening. But I wouldn't just willy-nilly pull everything. I mean, when you have state legislatures banning Chinese nationals from purchasing farmland, I mean, do we think they're going to take it with them? In fact, 30 years ago, people were afraid of Japan buying real estate. And I remember thinking, what, they're going to take the Rockefeller Center with them? I mean, in fact, they suffered a huge bath. They bought Rockefeller Center at high prices and sold it back at low prices. Americans made a huge amount of money. So I think we just do rational stuff. We just shouldn't run off and say, cut them out of everything. Let's say this is one tool among many, and it's a long game. I want to encourage the Chinese people and have contact with Americans to say, we all want to build a better future, and then try to find policies where it'd be tough where you have to, but don't isolate if you don't have to.
Go ahead.
Yeah, so my question is kind of related to current events. So we have the Ukraine war, we have kind of an uneasy alliance truce thing with like Russia and China. Do you think there might be something similar if, if there's kind of some sort of war, like some sort of like conflagration between the US and China? Do you think there might be some sort of alliance with Russia, Korea, maybe Iran? I think there's a way around that.
Look, as long as we have hostile, at least what they perceive to be as hostile policies towards each other, they are likely to work together against the United States. Now, I don't think either of them wants to go to war on the other's behalf. So this is not an alliance like NATO where we will stand together in war. But it certainly means economic support and whatnot. And I think Iran's a small player. I mean, Iran can cause trouble in the Middle East, but the last thing we want is to have the US like go on a massive bombing campaign. We can level the country. I think North Korea is a bit different because if China finds itself in a conflict with the US over Taiwan, starting another front in Korea, you have to say, and have that as a threat to South Korea is a very useful thing. So I mean, I'd set them apart from the others. Look, I think there's a good reason over the long term to hope one can draw Russia away from China, but so long as you sanction it, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, that's not going to happen. And given the current situation, how long does the war with Ukraine go? What's the outcome? What's the end game? What are the negotiations? I mean, how all of that stuff plays out. It's hard to imagine any time in the near to midterm that the Western relationship with Russia will improve very much. In which case, Russia's going to be very reliant on China. I mean, Russia's been, and not just China, it's India. So, I mean, one of the striking things the West needs to take note is the global South has not rushed to the West's aid when it comes to Ukraine. And US policymakers were shocked. I mean, they thought they just kind of say, hey, come follow us. And they looked behind them and there was nobody there. And the problem is, especially from the European standpoint, it's colonialism and a lot of stuff. We see this with France and Niger and other sorts of stuff. France has one of the most effective militaries in Europe. It's not for the Russians, and so they can kind of maintain their old colonial empire, basically. And you're seeing countries like Niger aren't very happy about that. And the same to Britain to a somewhat lesser degree, but a certain amount of the same kind of stuff. And the US has the problem of today. We believe in human rights, except when it comes to Mohammed bin Salman, he can kill as many people as he wants in Yemen and chop people up. I mean, I had lunch with Khashoggi. I was on a panel with Khashoggi. I knew the guy, right? I mean, you're not only murderers, you're chopping him up. Yeah, but we don't care. No big deal. And we believe in human rights. Okay. He's killed more people than the Russians have. So you want us to follow you on Russia, but you provide warplanes to the Saudis so they can kill Yemeni kids. Oh, right. You're a moral leader. So the West needs to take that into account. Kind of the question of soft power working with other countries, as I was asked earlier. That's one of the things the US and the West needs to take into account. That so that the Indians They want to counterweight to China, but you think they want to be our cat's paw and go to war if we go to war with China? Oh, no, thank you. And when an opportunity comes along for cheap oil, India has a major poverty population. Cheap oil is a great thing. Why should they sacrifice that because we tell them they shouldn't, right? So it's going to be a tough issue there. But I think the Russians are, quote, lost, if you want to put it that way, to the West so long as the Ukraine situation is where it's at. We just don't know what that outcome will be and how long it will take.
All right, I think we got time for one last question, so I'll go to you.
I just had a question. I think one of the major issues that led to Ukraine was a misidentification of what at least was on the Russian side perceived as legitimate security concerns for domestic consumption political issues. To what extent are Chinese concerns about Taiwan and about the disputed islands security based, and to what extent are they political?
Well, everything mixes together. Foreign policies around the world, including the United States, go back to the U.S. war with Mexico and the policy of the border with Britain. It was like, I don't know, 54-40 would fight. It was kind of the border we wanted to fight for. I mean, look, we went to war with Mexico and still have the country. And the debate was whether the U.S. should actually annex the whole thing. There's a Senator Albert Beveridge had this wonderful line that, like the Sabine virgins, they will grow to love their ravisher. Well, that's a great reason to take over a country. Sure, yeah, no. I mean, to some degree, I think some of those attitudes, kind of still float around in some other countries. Like for China's standpoint, number one is China talks about the century of humiliation. If you go to Shanghai, you need to walk along the front. And what you see are all of these European-style buildings with European names on them, like the British Mercantile Exchange. This was the Western concession in Shanghai, in which Chinese were not allowed to go in their own country. And that wasn't the only one. The Shantung, after World War I, they didn't give it back to China, they gave it to Japan. Japan grabbed Taiwan in 1895, went to war, they won. It went back to China in 1945, 1949, Chiang Kai-shek took the nationalists there and created the Republic of China. That essentially moved the government there. So the nationalism is real. I mean, you just don't dismiss that and just say it's all, no, I mean, look, I talk to Chinese students here, and I mean, I'd be interested in people in the audience that who think, in their view, Taiwan's part of China, right? I mean, we had an intern at Cato whose parents came to the US from Shanghai in 1949. And I asked Joe, what do you think of Taiwan? Oh, it should be independent. What do your parents think? Oh, it's part of China. And from their standpoint, it's not part of the PRC. It's part of this. I mean, there were ethnic Chinese who thought it was good when Hong Kong went back to China. Hong Kong was British because the Brits stole it in the Opium Wars. What were the Opium Wars over? Well, the Chinese didn't want all this opium sold to their people. So the Britain went to war to make them pay off all the kind of people whose wares they stole and to make the opium trade free. And then they grabbed some territory as well. Well, if you're Chinese, right, you look at that, it's like, excuse me? So that's part of its security. We saw what the US thought about Soviet influence on Cuba in 1962. Well, if you're Chinese, 100 miles off the coast is this really big island. Does it have a military relationship with the US? Might it ever be used as... So beyond that, there are domestic concerns. There's genuine nationalism in China, which at times the government tries to tamp down, at times it tries to use for its own purposes. I mean, this is a very dangerous thing. You flare it up too much, it may burn you. So it can very well be used politically, but the basis there is very real. And at some level, who are we to denounce nationalism when Americans have been perfectly nationalistic? Well, we're going to take the Philippines. We killed 200,000 Filipinos. Because it turns out the Filipinos had their own liberation movement fighting the Spanish. We took over and said, okay, now you're our subjects. And a lot of the Filipinos said, well, maybe not. And we spent a few years killing them off. I mean, so there's a lot of history there. I mean, like I said, I believe that Taiwan should be free and independent. The problem is, what do you do if you're in a very bad neighborhood where declaring that you were free and independent may very well start a war? So my view is, how do we keep the current situation? Effective autonomy. Taiwan has a democratic system. People can live their lives. but it does not claim separate nationhood, and China lives with that because, look, you start a war, think about trade, think about economics, just think about everything. None of us want to avoid that, but we both sides have to work on that, and I keep telling people, pull back, don't kind of accelerate things, you want to pull back.
All right, thank you again for being with us today. Quick, I'd like to announce to you guys that we'll be having our first student discussion series meeting on Wednesday. You'll all be getting an email about that, so check your emails. We hope to see you there. We hope to see you at our future events, and thank you for being with us here tonight.
Very good. How are you doing?
Yeah, well, the next traffic thing.
The Biden administration is quite good. They originally talked about decoupling, now talks about relocation. I talk to Chinese differently. They view this as being the same. I don't think so. I think it's an attempt by the administration to step back. And say, okay, we don't want to cut all content, we just want to focus on areas. But that's kind of happening in a lot of these areas. Exactly. In the issue of Taiwan, where the official U.S. ambiguity, you don't say. The president had polite occasions, and then all of these agents said, no.